Imagine a country so rich that in the 1950s it attracted migrants from Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, a place where highways, skyscrapers, and modern cities symbolized a future that looked brighter than much of the developed world. This country had the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, its currency was strong, and its citizens enjoyed a standard of living that rivaled Western nations. That country was Venezuela, and over the next few decades, it would experience one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history, losing nearly 90% of its GDP and becoming a warning to the entire world. To understand how this happened, we need to start with oil. In the early 20th century, massive oil discoveries transformed Venezuela almost overnight. By the mid-1900s, oil exports powered explosive growth. The government collected enormous revenues, infrastructure expanded rapidly, and Caracas became one of the most modern cities in Latin America. Oil money paid for education, healthcare, and public services, while imports flooded the country. Venezuela didn't need to manufacture much itself because oil dollars could buy anything from abroad. This created a powerful illusion of permanent wealth. But beneath the surface, the economy was dangerously unbalanced. Oil accounted for the majority of export earnings and government revenue. When oil prices were high, everything worked. When prices fell, cracks appeared. Instead of using oil wealth to diversify into manufacturing, technology, or competitive agriculture, successive governments relied even more heavily on crude exports. Over time, this dependency became an economic trap. In the 1970s, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, creating the state-owned oil giant PDVSA. At first, this seemed like a triumph of national sovereignty. Oil prices surged, and government spending exploded. Subsidies expanded, public employment grew, and the state became the central actor in nearly every part of the economy. For a while, it looked like proof that resource-rich countries could prosper through state control. Then reality struck. In the 1980s, oil prices collapsed. Government revenues plunged, debt piled up, and inflation surged. Living standards began to fall. By 1989, austerity measures triggered massive protests known as the Caracazo, signaling deep social frustration. Trust in traditional political parties eroded, and Venezuelans began searching for a radical alternative. That alternative arrived in the form of Hugo Chavez. Elected president in 1998, Chavez promised to use Venezuela's oil wealth to fight inequality, empower the poor, and break free from what he called neoliberal exploitation. When oil prices surged again in the 2000s, Chavez suddenly had vast resources to fund his vision. Social programs expanded dramatically, poverty initially declined, and Chavez became immensely popular. However, the economic foundations of these policies were fragile. Chavez tightened state control over industries, imposed price controls, nationalized private companies, and fired thousands of experienced engineers and managers from PDVSA after a strike. While oil revenues masked the damage, productivity collapsed across the economy. Businesses closed because they couldn't operate profitably under strict controls, and domestic production shrank. Instead of adjusting policies, the government doubled down. Cheap imported goods, paid for by oil dollars, replaced local production. This made Venezuela even more dependent on oil exports. When oil prices were high, shelves were full. When prices fell, shortages appeared almost instantly. The economy had become a one-engine plane flying at high altitude, with no backup systems. After Chavez's death in 2013, power passed to Nicolas Maduro. Unfortunately, this transition happened just as global oil prices began to collapse again. Unlike earlier downturns, Venezuela entered this crisis with weakened institutions, depleted reserves, massive debt, and an oil industry already in decline. The government responded by printing money to cover spending, triggering hyperinflation on a scale rarely seen outside of war zones. At its peak, inflation reached millions of %. Prices doubled in days, sometimes hours. The national currency became almost worthless, and ordinary citizens were forced to carry stacks of cash just to buy basic food. Savings evaporated. Salaries lost all meaning. Barter replaced money in some areas, and millions of Venezuelans fled the country in search of survival. Meanwhile, oil production collapsed. Lack of investment, mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions reduced output to a fraction of its former levels. Infrastructure decayed, refineries broke down, and blackouts became common. Without oil revenue, the government lost its primary source of dollars needed to import food and medicine. Shortages turned into humanitarian crises. International factors worsened the situation. Sanctions limited access to global financial markets, while political isolation reduced foreign investment. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were largely absent due to political tensions, leaving Venezuela without traditional financial lifelines. The economy contracted year after year, ultimately shrinking by nearly 90% from its peak, one of the largest peacetime economic collapses ever recorded. But it's important to understand that this collapse was not caused by a single factor. It wasn't just oil prices. It wasn't just socialism. It wasn't just sanctions. The real story is how multiple risks stacked on top of each other. Extreme dependence on a single commodity. Weak institutions. Short-term political incentives that favored spending over saving. Policies that destroyed private investment. And a refusal to change course when warning signs became impossible to ignore. Venezuela's tragedy offers powerful lessons for investors, policymakers, and citizens around the world. Resource wealth can be a blessing, but without diversification and strong institutions, it can become a curse. Easy money can hide structural weaknesses, but only temporarily. When the cycle turns, those weaknesses are exposed with brutal force. For global markets, Venezuela is a reminder that GDP numbers alone don't tell the full story. A country can appear wealthy on paper while its foundations rot underneath. For investors watching emerging markets today, the message is clear: diversification, rule of law, independent institutions, and sustainable fiscal policy matter more than any short-term boom. Today, Venezuela is slowly stabilizing from the bottom, but the damage is immense. Millions remain abroad, infrastructure is shattered, and rebuilding trust will take decades. Yet the story is not just about collapse. It is about choices, incentives, and the long-term consequences of ignoring economic reality. For the world's richest country by oil reserves to lose almost all of its economic output is not just a historical curiosity. It is a warning, because the forces that destroyed Venezuela are not unique. They exist wherever easy wealth replaces discipline, wherever politics overrides economics, and wherever leaders believe that prosperity can be printed, controlled, or commanded into existence. And that is why Venezuela's collapse matters far beyond its borders. It shows how quickly success can turn into disaster, how fragile modern economies really are, and how the line between wealth and ruin is far thinner than most people realize.